All right, let's talk about the rotating dungeon pool. So one of the things that Dragonflight introduced was 8 new dungeons every single season. So what we had in Shadowlands and BFA were, the same 8, 10, maybe sometimes even like 12 dungeons for the entire expansion, where they didn't rotate, and the only thing that realistically changed were just seasonal affixes, right? And coming into Dragonflight, that became a little bit different. First off, you have the seasonal affix, but in addition to that, Ian Hazzikostas talked about in an interview with Wowhead, is that they're going to be changing the Mythic Plus pool. They obviously are experimenting with bringing back keys. This was talking about in the Season 4 stuff. Now you just want to know if they plan on continuing this, or is this something you want to hear feedback on in this most recent season? This was Shadowlands Season 4 that they're referring to. And Ian says, for sure, that's the path we're going to take for Dragonflight Season 1. We're all well underway on updating old dungeons. The plan is a pool of 8 dungeons for the first Mythic Plus season, 4 Dragonflight dungeons, as well as some old fan favorites across the years. A couple of examples are Temple of the Jade Serpent from Mr. Pandaria and Court of Stars from Legion. And so Blizzard decided that they were going to be doing this thing where they did 4 Dragonflight dungeons and 4 Legacy dungeons, and they were going to rotate that. And they talk about, even though we have new seasonal affixes, we've observed over the course of an expansion that it's challenging for people when you're 12 to 15 months into the same dungeons to reach the same level of sophistication and refinement and community expectations for what you're supposed to know. So it's stratospherically high that it can be a rough experience for someone trying to get into it later to not have a patient group of friends to help you. So, I mean, that and a couple of other reasons, right? Like, they want the engagement level to continue to be high over the course of the entire expansion. And I think now, since we've pretty much seen the entire expansion, kind of what it's looked like so far, let's talk about, was it successful? I think that Blizzard having the rotating dungeon pool, I think we can kind of look back in retrospect and kind of determine whether or not it was successful. So first season, we have Ruby Life pools, Alg Academy, Azure Vault, and Noka Defensive, and those were all the Dragonflight dungeons. And the returning dungeons were Temple of the Jade Serpent, Shadow Moon Burial Grounds, Court, and Halls of Valor. They also had Thundering, which was an added variable into this as well, and seasonal affixes ended up getting removed. So right off the bat, the first season of the expansion is always going to have the most refinement coming into the season. The dungeons have an extensive amount of time of being able to be beta tested. There's a lot of tuning that happens beforehand, and that kind of changed the texture of what season 1 ended up looking like. Now, there was still a decent amount of tuning that had to happen in season 1 with a lot of the bosses. I think the bosses they came in and they wanted the bosses to be a bit harder, and they were. But then they were like, maybe they're too hard. And so they kind of nerfed some of the bosses to make sure that the healing checks were a bit less strict. But overall, the Season 1 dungeon pool, I think, was largely a success. The only major blemish, I think, is Shadow Moon Burial Grounds and Court of Stars being a bit too easy. Temple of the Jade Serpent probably needed a bit more dungeon tuning than it got. But overall, the Season 1 dungeon pool was fine. Then we jumped into Season 2. We got a bit of an affix overhaul. Seasonal affixes were removed. We had Brackenhide Hollow, Halls of Infusion, Oldemon, and Neltharis, which people thought that Brackenhide and Halls of Infusion were going to be terrible. Freehold, Underrot, Neltharian's Lair, and Vortex Pinnacle also were some of the returning dungeons. Personally, this was my least favorite season in regards to the dungeons. I just didn't like the dungeons in general, but the fact that they rotate every single season meant that because I didn't love this dungeon pool, I didn't particularly find it fun. I didn't think the metagame was like that great. Because I didn't necessarily find it fun, I didn't have to play that much, right? And I knew that I could come back the next season and find brand new dungeons. And so that was actually something that I kind of found to be a bit interesting. And then that leads us into Season 3, which is the current dungeon pool, which the only Dragonflight dungeons we have are both of the Dawns. Then we have Waker's Banner and Nataldazar from BFA, Darkheart Thicket and Blackrook from Legion, Everbloom from WoD, and Throne of the Tides from Cataclysm. And so let's talk about some of the negatives first. I think one of the largest negatives with this, and we've seen it every single season, is dungeon tuning. With an expansion-long dungeon set, right, where the dungeons are set for the entire expansion, that kind of allows Blizzard to get them into maintenance mode a lot faster. And what I mean when I say that is they're able to get bosses into a spot where they're more healthy. They're able to get trash into a spot where they're more healthy. There just needs to be less tuning from Season 2 to Season 3 and Season 1 to Season 2 because the tuning's already happened, right? And so whenever Season 2 came out, Oldemon bosses were pretty rough. The Halls of Infusion bosses were pretty rough. Every dungeon ends up needing a timer change. Vortex Pinnacle's timer was still very hard up until the very end. Underrot was too easy, that kind of thing. So the tuning was a bit tough. Quarter Stars and Shadow Moon Burial Grounds were remarkably easier than the rest of the keys. A lot of the bosses, so I think Alcathar Academy Tree Boss, Croth, Raging Tempest, last boss of Court of Stars, all needed tuning, like pretty extensive tuning. This season, we're seeing Rise still needs a lot of tuning, and we haven't gotten it yet. Everbloom probably still needs the Lashers to not do on-death affixes, and we still haven't gotten it yet. They probably should have reworked Soulbound Goliath, and if this boss was something that we had for multiple seasons, we probably would have seen a Soulbound Goliath rework. But that's kind of been one of the major blemishes, I think, with the rotating dungeon pool, is that the tuning hasn't always been that great. Now it does happen, and I think that Blizzard, to their credit, has done a better job of tuning this expansion than they historically have done with Mythic Plus. And it's clear that they're putting in a lot more time and effort into making sure that Mythic Plus seasons are great. They've also been bug fixing a lot of issues with a lot of the keys over the course of the entire expansion, making sure that they are presentable and not buggy. Now, another major drawback of doing it like this is if you're playing Mythic Plus a bit more casually, this is a lot harder to kind of jump into sometimes. So now what Ian said, he said that like stratospherically, it's so stratospherically high that it can be a rough experience for someone trying to get into it later if you don't have a patient group of friends. The opposite is also kind of true with that, where if you played in season 1 and you start like halfway through season 3, people already have an expectation that you've been playing every single season, right? And people already have the expectation that you started playing at the very beginning of the season as well, and you're kind of learning. And so this is one of those things that where in the past, if you played season 1, you kind of know what you're getting into in season 3. Now that's not necessarily the case, and things are a lot different with the brand new dungeon pool, especially if you're not playing regularly. And so I think that that's like another major drawback. Now, the upsides, I think one of the biggest upsides is that you're not farming the same dungeons over and over again every single season for the exact same loot pool. I think that was horrible. In BFA and Shadowlands, having to farm the exact same trinket over and over again. I remember having to farm IQD out of the other side 3 seasons in a row. I thought that was really bad. And so I think that the rotating dungeon pool, one of the benefits is that you get, new loot from Mythic Plus every single season. Another, in my opinion, major benefit of the new rotating Mythic Plus pool is that you kind of get new dungeons every single season. And if you're playing Mythic Plus as your main source of in-game content, I think it is a lot better for people who are Mythic Plus mains who play it regularly, right? Where a lot of the fun that comes in Mythic Plus comes down to like innovation in Mythic Plus. You're learning new stuff with your friends. You're kind of, seeing the keys for the first time. You're kind of getting better. You're developing that synergy with your group. You're learning new things, and you're being able to time higher keys, and you're having that reprogression every single season, as opposed to only reprogression relative to key level. You're reprogressing your knowledge, and I think that that's actually a very strong advantage of the rotating dungeon pool in general. Now, another criticism of this, and this was brought up by Ellesmere almost 2 years ago at this point, a year and a half ago at this point. He says that season 1 needs to be the 8 new Dragonflight dungeons, and then rotating in old dungeons into season 2 or season 3. That was a pretty major criticism of this as a whole. Now, looking back on it, having seen it play out, I actually don't necessarily think that I agree even still. I think that having watched it played out, I'm actually fine with the 4 new dungeons and the 4 legacy dungeons, assuming that they've been tuned properly. I don't think that we needed the 8 Dragonflight dungeons at the very beginning. Personally, I think we probably should have had the 8 Dragonflight dungeons for season 3, but it looks like on the horizon that we're going to have the 8 Dragonflight dungeons for the Fated season. It is a bit weird that we haven't necessarily seen them as much, and it creates a lot more work for Blizzard to be able to kind of introduce that. But at the same point, it is completely brand new dungeons every single season, and I think that actually kind of creates this interesting paradigm where you have to completely relearn every single dungeon. And on top of that too, it's like what utility is good in every single key kind of varies from season to season. And it's not going to be a situation where, you had all of the Dragonflight dungeons at the very beginning. And then the second season, it's Alcathar Academy, Ruby Life Pools, Azure Vault, Noku Defensive, and you already know what's going on in those. I think that the brand new features is a distinct advantage of it. So as a whole, how have I personally felt about it? I've been pretty positive on it. Although I think that you have to learn. you have to know that it's coming from a perspective of somebody who does Mythic Plus basically every single week. Mythic Plus is their main in-game content that they enjoy the most. They do a lot of dungeons, and they push title every single season. If I was somebody, I understand from a perspective of somebody who plays maybe a bit more casually, it might be a bit more daunting. But as somebody who does play Mythic Plus as their main source of in-game content, I feel like this has been a strong success. And I hope that Blizzard actually continues on within the future. I think that one of the things that they need to make sure is better in the future is they need to really make sure that their tuning is on point. Or if their tuning isn't on point, they're a bit more aggressive at tuning the keys. They have been a bit better, but even still in this season, there's still a lot of stuff that's kind of broken, right? And needs to be fixed. We saw it in season 1, even though they had a lot of beta testing in it beforehand. We saw it in season 2. They need to continue to be a bit more aggressive with that. As for seasonal affixes, I think I'll probably save that for another video. I'm really interested in hearing what you guys have to say down in the comment section below, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Goodbye.